Last night, MPs voted in favour of a bill which blocks Johnson from being able to opt for a no-deal Brexit. That's something we discussed in yesterday's video. Johnson had previously said that if MPs voted against the government in this matter, he'd be forced to call a general election. So that's exactly what Johnson did Wednesday night. He asked MPs to support his move for a general election. He needed 2/3 of the Commons to support him, and, well, it didn't go swimmingly. In this video, we're going to show you exactly what went down in the House of Commons, and share a section of our latest podcast where we discuss the vote and why opposition parties didn't support the call for an election. If you want to hear the full episode or subscribe to our podcast, you can find it on the TLDR Podcast's YouTube channel, or within your favourite podcast app. We're still rolling out to some apps, so if you can't find Too Long Didn't Read there, then take a look at tldrnews.co.uk/too long to see where you can find it. Links to the channel and the website are in the description. So before we discuss the vote for the general election, let's take a look at what happened earlier that day. That's because even before Johnson officially called for an election, things got tense between Johnson and Corbyn at Prime Minister's questions.
Jeremy Corbyn!
Yesterday, it was revealed, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister's negotiating strategy is to run down the clock, and that the Attorney-General told the Prime Minister his belief that the European Union would drop the backstop was a complete fantasy. Are these reports accurate, or can the Prime Minister provide the detail of the proposals he's put forward to the EU?
The Prime Minister!
I tell you, Mr. Speaker, what our negotiating strategy is, and it is to get a deal by the summit on October the 17th, and to take this country out of the EU on October the 31st, to get Brexit done. What is the slogan? What do we want? What do we want? Dither and delay. When do we want it? We don't know. That's his policy. That's his policy.
Jeremy Corbyn!
Mr. Speaker, my first question to the Prime Minister, and no answer given. Any rational human being would assume, therefore, none have been put, and there is no answer to that question.
That if this bill is passed this afternoon, I've said I don't want an election. I don't think he wants an election. But there's a petition on his own Labour. There's a petition on his own Labour website with 57,000 people, including Carol, Nigel, Graham, and Phoebe, calling for an election. I don't know whether there's a Jeremy on the list. But, Mr. Speaker, I know he's worried about free trade deals with America, but there's only one chlorinated chicken that I can see in this House, and he's on that bench.
Now this is the moment when MPs voted to block a no deal, the act which led to Johnson calling the general election.
So the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Unlock. Point of order, Mr. Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Then I say to the Prime Minister that this House expects him to uphold the law and to fulfil the obligations that will be placed upon him by this bill and prevent this country from leaving the European Union on the 31st of October without a deal.
We now come to the motion on the early parliamentary general election. To move the motion, I call the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, the House of Commons has passed a bill devised by the leader of the opposition, who I see is not in his place, but his colleagues. He is characteristically evasive, if not frit, Mr. Speaker. Clear that there is therefore only one way forward for the country. I'm afraid it is time for this country to decide whether the leader of the opposition or I go to those negotiations in Brussels on the 17th of October to sort this out.
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Well, I don't know whether the House wants a debate. I'll be very, very brief. I was going to join in if other people were going to debate, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for encouraging me. No doubt the deep distress of everybody else waiting to have an important vote. I merely say that I found these exchanges quite predictable. They've been well rehearsed before we took place. I do think the Prime Minister, with the greatest respect, has a tremendous skill in keeping a straight face whilst he's being so disingenuous.
In this vote, Johnson needs 2/3 of MPs to support this proposal. It doesn't matter how many people abstain or vote against, he simply needs 2/3 of MPs to say yes to the general election.
Is that there shall be an early parliamentary general election. As many as have that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. Division! Clear the lobby. Order. Order.
The ayes to the right, 298. The noes to the left, 56.
So the ayes have it, but the House will be aware that the motion has not obtained the majority required under the Fixed Term Parliaments Act 2011.
Johson actually managed to achieve a big majority, if you were just comparing the ayes to the noes, as we so often do. But when you look at the total number of MPs, it falls far short of the 2/3 supermajority he needed. So why did this happen? Well, let's hear what the team had to say earlier on in the Too Long Didn't Read podcast. So speaking about the general election, there was another vote yesterday evening, another vote that Johson ended up losing. In fact, I think he's 3 for 3 on losing votes so far since becoming Prime Minister.
Well done.
I mean, you've got to have a 100% record for something. It's just maybe not quite what he was aiming for. This is something we spoke about in yesterday's podcast when Zach predicted that Labour wouldn't support the movement, generally because they're scared of the date being moved and because they kind of want to embarrass Johson by forcing him into requesting an extension.
I think you're giving me a lot of credit there. I think they might have actually already said they're not. I don't know if it was a prediction
No.
to just reporting.
They had said it. But
okay,
I mean,
well, there you go.
I enjoyed the analysis, so I was giving it to you. So does the success of the Ben bill significantly change the election prospects, do you think?
Prospects of an election happening?
Yes.
Well, yeah, so it depends on who you listen to in the Labour front benches. Very typical. There's a little bit of Labour Brexit ambiguity. But so Corbyn and Healy, who's in the front benches, have said that actually once the legislation is passed, so, assuming all goes to plan, that would be Monday, Labour will support a general election. And that means that if Boris can find a way to bring back that particular motion, the motion he tried yesterday, that requires 2/3 to trigger a general election as part of the Fixed Term Parliament Act, he probably would have the numbers, assuming that Corbyn and co supported it. There's an open legal question as to whether or not he actually can bring that back so soon, having tried the same motion yesterday. But I'm not sure as to whether or not he can, so I'm just going to have to leave it there. I don't think anyone
Nobody
is,
really
though,
knows.
so that's how it is. But if you listen to Keir Starmer, who was interviewed, I think, yesterday as well, he said that they would only support an election once the extension had actually been achieved, which I think is a far better electoral strategy for Labour. An October election is exactly what Boris would want. Firstly, he can campaign on the, if you elect me, I'm going to leave the EU. No ifs, no buts. 31st.
Yeah.
Whereas, obviously, if the election date is somewhere in November, he looks like a failed Brexiteer. That's Farage's dream. And as we talked about yesterday, that should split the vote.
Yeah, I was going to agree with that, actually. I think that is probably the best strategy for Labour, is to wait until after the deadline, because then, no matter what happens with this election, it is going to be pretty much entirely around the Brexit debate. I know that politics has pretty much been centred around Brexit since the vote. That kind of goes without saying, but I think especially if the election happens before the deadline, it is just, what do you want to happen with Brexit? Do you want Johnson in, who kind of centred his entire candidacy around, I will leave on the 31st, do or die, and then obviously the Labour sort of ambiguity strategy. Whereas if you have the delay, Boris has by definition failed on that promise. You've kind of shown him to not be capable of doing that. Whether that's Boris's fault or not is kind of beside the point for Labour. You've demonstrated that Johnson and his party have been unable to carry out the promise that got him into power. So it is in Labour's interest to try and get that general election later than the deadline. Whether they'll be able to do so is another question entirely, but I can completely agree with you, Zach. I think it's definitely in Labour's best interest to try and have it as late as possible. The other question, the other thing that was brought up then was to do with how the election would even be called, considering that we can't have the same question in the same parliamentary sitting, which is something that Theresa May, I think, had a bit of difficulty with her withdrawal agreement. Obviously, you need a 2/3 majority to be able to call the election, which is why it failed last night, even though there was a massive support. There was I can't remember what the majority was, but it's in the 200s of ayes against noes. It didn't reach that 2/3 threshold. There is, however, a way of basically removing the or changing the Fixed Term Parliament Act, and then you would only need a simple majority because you're basically changing the legislation. Exactly. So there is a way that he can do it, but it would be undermining, that legislation which was brought in 2011 to try and stop a Prime Minister being able to call an election whenever he or her wanted.
I don't think Labour would support that particular bill, whatever happened,
either.
Though. But I think maybe Boris could be hedging his bets on the SNP because they are obviously raring to go for an election.
Yes.
No ifs, no buts. Like whatever happens,
we'll support an election. If you enjoyed this section of the podcast, you can hear the full discussion on YouTube or in your favourite podcast app by clicking the link in the description. We'll continue to keep you updated on this bill, the possibility of an election, and everything else. So make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Also, you can hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a video. And if you want to find more from TLDR, you can find us across all social networks simply by searching for TLDR News. And if you want your name at the end of the videos, just like these people, then be sure to back us on Patreon. There's a link to that in the description.